Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Lee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Healthcare Business Resiliency, Modern Challenges Require Modern Solutions. I'll be your moderator throughout this session. Before we jump into our discussion, our objectives for today are to understand some strategies for business resiliency and healthcare, from security threats to supply chain disruptions and other unforeseen events, both accidental and malicious. Practical mitigation options and approaches taken by various healthcare organizations, and some real-world challenges and lessons learned from others. With us, we're joined by an auspicious bunch of speakers, so let's start with Austin Park. Austin?
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion and learning something new. So I'm Austin Park. I currently serve as CTO at LCMC Health System.
Hi, folks. Thanks again for having us and taking some time to listen to an important topic of business resiliency. I'm Mike Hedgie. I'm with Amazon Web Services. I focus on ways to make it simpler for health systems to deploy and operate their EHR. Why EHRs? About 30 years ago, I joined a tiny little startup became Epic, and I spent about 30 years as their technical fellow. Again, focusing on ways to make it easier for folks to deploy and operate their EHR.
Hi, I'm Donnie Wilson. I work with Amazon Web Services on our global healthcare team. Prior to coming to AWS, I was a chief architect and information security officer, and here at AWS, I focus on essentially helping customers focus on how to build resilient, secure architectures, how to make life easier using the AWS cloud, but also while maintaining a high bar for security and compliance. Obviously, resiliency is a key topic, and so I'm happy to be here and hopefully contribute and field any questions that are required.
Great. Well, thank you all for speaking at today's discussion. I think it's important to frame up this conversation as to why we think it's important that we're asking you all to listen to us chat today. So why is business resiliency so critical in the current healthcare technology landscape? Let's start with you, Austin. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I didn't realize you were going to start with me. Business resiliency, especially in healthcare, it's taken on a pretty new meaning, especially with all the security issues and what have you. I remember when I first started 20 years ago, it was business resiliency just meant redundant infrastructure, just hardening your environment. One of my first projects was building out a data center and just pouring as much redundancy into it as possible, because it was about equipment failure and trying to get around that. Today, we have so many variables that we have to deal with, from security issues to human failures to things like availability of skilled labor, resource limitations. So I think today when we think about business resiliency, it's really about having the options and flexibility to be able to remediate any issues that may come about so we can continue operations. And there's a plethora of different things we have to think about. Now, I think some of the other speakers especially will probably be able to go a little bit more into some of the cloud strategies here. But for me, speaking as a CTO in a health system, I want to have as many options available as possible, because I don't know all the different scenarios that we have to deal with. So business resiliency is about really having the agility to respond in different ways based on the scenarios.
Thanks, Austin. And Donnie, same question. Why are you here today? Why do you think business resiliency matters?
Yeah, so kind of supporting what Austin said, and especially serving in different capacities in previous roles, disaster recovery and essentially high availability for critical systems was always at the heart of what we tried to do. And this conversation is shifting more of this resiliency, like architecture approach. So it really extends beyond just those two concepts, and kind of leverages the ability of a workload or a particular system to recover from any kind of failures or disruptions with minimal or no downtime. A lot of times, automation comes into play here, and as technology is leveraged for different healthcare deliveries, we as individual consumers and providers of healthcare, we kind of have the expectation that these services remain available, that we can depend on them consistently. So, at AWS, we obviously try to focus on taking those into consideration and really working with customers that want to leverage the cloud to kind of build those table stakes into resilient architectures.
Thanks, Donnie. Lastly, Mike, same question.
Yeah, I echo what Austin and Donnie shared. The other thing to look at is I think business resiliency also means being able to adapt quickly to changing priorities. You take UC San Diego, they were challenged with diagnosing pneumonia in COVID-19 patients. So they implemented an imaging model to run against radiology images to help identify those hard to detect cases. And they were able to do this in 10 days using secure HIPAA eligible services. And it's the thing, healthcare industry has a reputation of adopting new technology a little slower than the other industries. But one thing that we've really learned about ourselves through the pandemic is that healthcare actually can move fast and still be secure and reliable. And UC San Diego is an example of that.
All right. Thanks, Mike. I think you all did a great job framing up why we're having this conversation. And we're hearing a lot about the different threats that organizations are facing. But Austin, from your perspective, what are some of the largest threats to business resiliency that healthcare organizations are currently facing?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things that we probably will address a little more in depth is, just cybercrime as a whole, some of the security threat, that healthcare organizations face. It's probably more prevalent this year than it was last year, and and every year it seems to get worse and worse when different threats come about. But in addition to the security threats and outside forces, we also have a lot of issues around rising cost, availability of skilled labor, like I mentioned before. There is, and we still have the old problems of equipment failure and redundancy needs. So when we look at all these different things, I don't know if we can just build everything in-house anymore. We have to look at different strategies for taking advantage of whatever tools that are available and resources that are at our disposal to help meet some of those challenges. I think if I were to frame it up, rising costs, skilled labor shortages, and security threats are probably three of the biggest concerns.
Wonderful. Thanks, Austin. We appreciate that CTO perspective. And Mike, in your role at AWS, more on the vendor side, what's your perspective of the biggest threats currently faced by healthcare organizations as it pertains to business resiliency?
Yeah, it's as we talk to the healthcare community, we really, and this is double clicking a little bit more into what Austin was mentioning, as far as we really can't underestimate the impact staff shortages play in healthcare business resiliency. According to the US Department of Labor statistics, September of last year was the first time since February of 2020 that healthcare staffing numbers were at that same level. So we've gone over 31 months, 940 days of adapting services to the staff that you have. And in some cases, that means shutting down some of your services. So there's a growing number of initiatives out there to improve that caregiver experience, to keep that staff, and then to make them more effective as well. An example of that is Houston Methodist. They developed a tool using natural language processing and ambient listening to capture conversations, create notes, and automatically complete documentation in the EHR during a patient visit. And the contact list, they did this leveraging Amazon Lex, which is the same service behind Alexa. And we're starting to see some trends in that area to keep the staff a little bit more engaged. And in healthcare IT, the Great Resignation is a serious threat. Folks are looking elsewhere in other industries, and we need to keep our rock stars that are doing the system administration of these systems motivated and engaged.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And Austin, building off something you said, cybersecurity is obviously a huge topic in healthcare and business resiliency at the moment. So what security considerations should a healthcare organization keep in mind when developing their business resiliency strategy? And Donnie, we'll ask you first.
Yeah, so especially with the kind of piggybacking off the last question, I think that your people and your process have to be foundational in any strategy that you try to establish. I work with customers all the time, and we have a huge technology debt and a technology stack that we talk about. And the fact is, you simply can't buy technology as a strategy. It has to kind of solve a problem. So if you think about your business resiliency, it leads me to kind of think most strategically about, the problem at hand, which is, keeping your systems up and going, but really it's about the data, the protection of the data that you have. And so maybe an exercise to consider when developing your strategy is to think through like the attack services. I hope that most have heard of like a kill chain, for example. So if you think about the attack services that are described in a kill chain, a lot of this would include, securing access to your data, leveraging encryption to ensure that the data is protected and that the integrity of your data is in place. And of course, a strong monitoring of your systems and the data itself to ensure that, you have a baseline for access patterns and that essentially you are well informed when those patterns are no longer normal, and that those could be indicators of compromise. So I would say start with the basics, the people in the process, and establish those and that end goal in mind, and then start leveraging technology to enable those capabilities and those needs.
Thanks, Donnie. Yeah, I think that people and process focus is very important there. And Austin, from your perspective as an executive at a healthcare organization, anything to add on what Donnie said in terms of developing that comprehensive security strategy as it pertains to business resiliency?
Well, I think, some of the things Danny mentioned is extremely important. We want to make sure that the foundation of, like authentication, being able to monitor the environment for any lateral movements and other things are all in place. I guess what I would emphasize, though, is that there isn't a one way or one approach or one system that can help protect the environment. We've got to have layers and layers of protection. And the reason for that is that it gives us some flexibility in terms of how we respond as well. I would hate to have an environment where we only have a singular response to every incident or issue that comes about. I think it's fair to say that today that, I think it's fair to say that every health system, if they haven't already been, a victim of some level of compromise within their environment, that they will be in short order. Now, the question really is, how much will that impact your operation? Will it shut you down, or will it be a relative short nuisance that you can recover from? And so I think we want to make sure we have systems that allow us to respond appropriately to whatever issue that we're facing, instead of having to take a more aggressive approach than we need to. One other note on this is especially on ransomware and the rise in profit in ransomware. So I just read an article about maybe a month ago that talked about ransomware and cybercrime as a whole being the most lucrative crime business in all of crime. It's got the highest payback for the least amount of risk in terms of being able to get caught and what have you. So I think we almost have a responsibility to make sure we put systems in place so that we don't have to pay the ransom in order to recover our systems. If we can do that, we will lessen the rise in incidents like ransomware attacks, because the reason why they're rising is that they're effective. They're generating revenue. They're generating lots of revenue. And so it's important that when we build these systems, that not only do we make sure that we have, we're using multi-factor authentication to prevent our accounts being, compromised, that we're putting in sufficient EDR systems, and we're all of that. But it's also important that we have a last line of defense to determine what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're not, and to be able to recover without having to pay the ransom.
Wonderful. Thank you, Austin. And gonna kind of build off of that one. So you mentioned ransomware attacks a few times here being actually probably one of the most central concerns in cybersecurity. I'm guessing most of us are generally aware with what they are, but can you elaborate a little bit more on what one looks like in a healthcare organization and just how it impacts business operations?
So I think, especially to the audience that we have, it's probably preaching rudimentary information to them, but I know we're all terrified, especially in healthcare, of being the subject of a ransomware attack. In essence, attackers will find some way into your environment, usually through some sort of email-borne phishing scheme, to get access to some credentials, and then once they're in, they're able to move laterally within your environment to try and identify where your sources of data or systems are, and they're able to download certain rootkits or what have you, and then take basically control of that data by encrypting that information and holding you ransom to unencrypt it.
Gotcha. Understood. Thanks, Austin. We're making a little bit more of a lateral move here. So, another big issue with business resiliency and continuity that we're seeing organizations is chip shortages and supply chain issues. It's impacting a lot of industries. But, Austin, can you speak a little bit to how it's impacting healthcare organizations in particular?
Yeah, I think all of my contemporaries in healthcare can attest to the chip shortage and the pain that it's causing all of us. So last year we knew that we needed to move our application delivery platform to a new target platform to make sure that we're keeping up with the performance needs that we're going to have as we upgrade, especially with the new versions of Epic that we needed to support. Now, we knew that there would be chips, that there would be long lead times. So we actually went to the capital committee a year in advance to see if we can spend 2022 funding in 2021. And we thought we were well in advance by doing this by 4 or 5 months before we needed to actually have the systems up, got the funding, placed the orders. Make a long story short, we waited over 7.5 months for millions of dollars worth of Cisco server infrastructure to arrive so we can make that change. Now, that is becoming a more too common occurrence, not only in healthcare, but just throughout the industry. And I'm hoping that at some point in time that the supply chain issues will abate. However, it has taught us a big lesson that if we are dependent on the supply chain working the way it's supposed to meet our project guidelines and everything else that we need to do, we need a different strategy for it. And so we need to be able to figure out what's the different options. I will say in 2022, I was able to go back to the leadership team and say, hey, this is an issue that all of us face, and they were somewhat understanding of that. But Michael mentioned Jeremy over at Tubbs. I had a discussion with him on something else, and then talking with that group. They leverage public cloud resources at AWS specifically for the application delivery layer, as well as their Epic layer. And he was talking about the ability to change their, the resources that they use for the presentation layer in a weekend. And that's a right now it's not a common thing. So I can kind of go, oh, that's pretty cool. But I wonder in maybe 2 or 3 years, if half the industry is able to make adjustments on the fly like that in a weekend, and I'm still taking 7.5 months to make that adjustment, plus another couple of months to get that in place, will I be able to defend that position? So I think all of us are starting to look at, that flexibility, that agility requires some level of strategic planning up front. And I think that's why we're having these discussions. What some of the modern solutions and resources we can take advantage of to an age-old problem that we've had. The chip shortage has put a huge exclamation point on the on resource management that we've always had to do. But I think it's something that I personally have. It has not escaped me that is something we've got to look at going forward into 2023 and 24. How do we do that better?
Thanks, Austin. And Donnie, you mentioned a little bit earlier the people and process component being critical to developing a comprehensive security strategy. But moreover, the people and process element is critical to the management of technical infrastructure in its entirety. So that is a significant component of healthcare business resiliency, not just the cybersecurity elements. So, Austin, managing an IT team at a hospital, what are some of the biggest management challenges that healthcare organizations currently face in terms of the people and the process with business resiliency?
Well, from a people perspective, I think we touched on this kind of the skill set shortage, just the ability to actually add additional people to assign them to manage specific domains of technology. I think we have way too many domains of technology, way too many disparate systems, which is exasperating the labor shortage. but overall, from a management perspective, I think the other concern that we have is we have we always talk about the lack of tools, but in some regards, it's not the lack of tools, it's the lack of right tools. We have a ton of tools that we currently use. And I would bet that if we went to, the health systems that are represented on the, I guess in this discussion today, then most of them will be hard pressed to be able to name all the various tools that they use in the environment, from SolarWinds to whatever it may be. The reason why we have so many tools is that at some point in time, that tool fulfilled a specific job or function that we needed, and then when it didn't, then we brought out another tool, and when it didn't, we brought out another tool. But I guess in the historical landscape, it does take some time to actually implement a tool. And once you've made that investment, you're really not going to discard that investment very quickly. So what we end up with is lots of tools and lots of decisions on what we want to maintain. So that's certainly a challenge, was how healthcare is maintained today, because there are so many disparate systems. We need a ton of different tools to be able to manage and monitor them.
Gotcha. Thanks, Austin. So we took about the last 25 minutes or so to talk about some of the challenges that we've been facing in business continuity and resiliency within healthcare. But we'd also like to talk about some potential solutions here as well. So obviously there's no magic solution. All three of the panelists have said that. But we do believe that leveraging the cloud, and in particular AWS, can help address some of these issues that we've been talking about. So Donnie, starting with you, what are some ways specifically that AWS can address some of the security concerns that we've discussed?
Yes, thanks. We always at AWS, we like to say that the security is a top priority, or it is the top priority. And so I think, if you kind of look at how we design our services specifically, it's inherently baked in to how we do business and build services in the grand scheme of things. So, for example, all of our services have the capability to have robust logging. For example, all of the services are, whether you access those through the console or through the various methods, that underneath the hood, they're all API calls, and all that activity gets logged, for example, into a service called AWS CloudTrail. And really, this just gives you full visibility to what's going on in the environment, and in specific your environment. So it just, talking about those foundational capabilities is important to just essentially setting up customers for success in leveraging the AWS cloud. Another couple of really important points is, we talked about table stakes and foundational capabilities. For example, if you have data that's in movement, you can leverage secure connectivity over endpoints, leveraging TLS. So all of our endpoints essentially have the ability to leverage TLS for encryption in transit of data in transit, as well as all of our storage services support encryption. It's really kind of thinking about, there is no magic wand, but if each one of the particular services that you use have standard capabilities built into those, it really sets you up for success. And in particular, we even have an approach for this called the well-architected framework. And so if you kind of look at that approach and you look at the pillars that are defined there, essentially there's two that are focused on resiliency and security. So we have a security pillar and a reliability pillar that dives deeper into exactly how you can leverage AWS to build secure and reliable solutions with common and best practice architectural approaches.
Yeah, I think a little bit of a higher level. If we focus on the impact of ransomware on healthcare business resiliency, as Austin mentioned, it's a very lucrative field if you are a black hatter. I read, what was it, last week, that 15 U.S. healthcare systems operating in 61 hospitals have already hit by ransomware this year. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not aware that any of them have compromised or infected the EHR. But when a ransomware attack is identified, and even if, and perhaps especially if it hasn't hit the EHR, the responsible thing to do is to protect that data and to take the EHR offline. Now, sometimes this can be for a couple of days or even a couple of weeks. I heard that one health system says that it costs $1 million a day in lost revenue to be offline. And I'm sure each health system has their own number. Yeah, what can we do to help the business be a little bit more resilient? And I'd like to highlight things we're doing with Austin and Louisiana Children's Medical Center. We're creating a cloud read-only copy of their EHR in AWS. These are air-gapped, near real-time replicas, so that if the on-premises EHR needs to be taken offline due to ransomware, caregivers not directly impacted by that attack can still point their web browser to a cloud replica to be able to see a patient's encounter history, or the medication list, or the allergy list. And furthermore, once you have that replica in AWS, you can now start taking immutable backups of the data, so that if the EHR does get compromised, you can use these immutable backups as recovery points to be able to get you back up to speed a lot more quickly.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. So we've been talking about supply chain issues and the chip shortage of Paramount during this conversation today. How does AWS help address some of those availability and scaling issues? And I'll start with you, Mike.
Thanks. We've had a lot of experience at this. For over 16 years, AWS has been delivering cloud services to millions of customers around the world with a wide variety of use cases. And yeah, we have the most operational experience at greater scale than any other cloud provider. And you know, it really comes down to experience. And internally, we say that there's no compression algorithm for experience, because you can't learn certain lessons until you get to different milestones at scale. And so AWS has the most extensive global infrastructure. No other cloud provider offers as many regions or availability zones connected by low latency, high throughput, redundant network paths, 87 availability zones across 27 geographic regions around the world. Plans for 20 more availability zones in 7 more regions. And here in the United States, we have 4 regions plus 2 government cloud regions. And each of these regions have at least 3 availability zones. In most healthcare organizations, what do? You spread your infrastructure costs 2 data centers if you have them. Some only have 1, and they put their storage arrays in different corners of that data center, but you have 2. Think about this: a reference architecture for running Epic, or really any EHR on AWS, calls for 2 regions, and within each region, use 3 availability zones. So just imagine the increased resiliency you get by spreading your EHR across 6 data centers. And that's exactly what you do with our reference architectures.
Thanks, Mike. And Austin, based on your experience working with the public cloud on AWS at LCMC, what's your experience been with availability and scaling, and how AWS can help you address some of those issues?
Well, it's certainly impressive, and we wouldn't be looking at AWS to do a read-only copy of Epic if it wasn't. I think I do want to emphasize, though, I mean, there isn't a single right answer for everyone. I think depending on your circumstance and what you're looking at, there are different solutions and different ways you should look at addressing your strategy. What I will say, though, is AWS, public cloud like AWS is such a powerful resource. To not factor it into your overall strategy or decision making, it's like missing out on an entire segment of resources that you should be designing into your strategy. So I think that's, to Mike's point when he was talking about the 6 availability zones and what have you, there's no way that any single entity can replicate that kind of availability. If it wasn't cost prohibitive, it would be just an architectural kind of a high bar that would be difficult to hit and maintain. So what I will say is that when we started looking at AWS, someone asked, like, is that your cloud strategy? And I remember going to an event last year at Chime, actually, And one of the speakers talked about the fact that they didn't have a cloud strategy. They had a business, reliability and resiliency strategy, and cloud happened to be a part of that. And I think that's an important point to make, is that regardless of what your plans are with a cloud or with AWS, if you have a resource available to you that has that much availability, where you can actually build in the kind of resiliency that Mike just talked about, was a read-only and immutable copy of that thing, you would be hard pressed not to take advantage of it. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing it. And so far, based on the cost to value, I think it's a phenomenal strategy for us. So we're very happy with it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Austin. So, Donnie, going back to your point about people and process, AWS can help with management monitoring and the maximal utilization of your process and the people who are managing your system. So, how does AWS help organizations manage and monitor their technical infrastructure?
For sure. So we like to talk about, there's a lot of different technologies and services that AWS leverages and makes available to customers. But if I had to focus on probably the top three areas that would help improve the management and monitoring specifically, I would like to highlight like the ability to kind of monitor and have full visibility with something called CloudTrail and in combination with CloudWatch. And those, like I said, those log all API calls across the environment. So everything from billing to, identity access management, if somebody was to interact with a key management service, basically all of the management type of events that would take place in your ecosystem would get logged through some kind of an API call. And then through that can be fed into something called CloudWatch, which gives you full visibility into doing like metrics and dashboards, and even set you up for success with automation. So imagine having an ITSM system that could then interact and sort of receive information and either launch tickets or even provision resources for you automatically. So that would be probably one area. Another area is it's obviously important in healthcare specifically, is around compliance. So we have a service called AWS Config, and whenever you turn that on, it records essentially the state of your services as they're deployed. So I remember essentially one of the challenges I had in the past going through multiple audits was around change management. And so the auditors would typically come in and ask us questions around proving that that we followed a change management process. And the question that was always so challenging to answer was, okay, great, you logged a ticket, you went through, you made your change, but how do we know what the state of that service was, or the state of that resource was prior to you making the change? And it was always somewhat challenging to document. How do you know if somebody changed your environment if you didn't actually follow the change management process? Well, AWS Config offers continuous recording, and therefore you can run reports and say that on a given date and time, this is how a specific solution or service is configured. And then that leads me to the third, point here around improving like your monitoring and management of your ecosystem, is we have a service called GuardDuty that's in close combination with Security Hub. So GuardDuty sort of looks through all of your different environments and looks for particular indicators of compromise, but then feeds that into something like Security Hub, which is like a single dashboard that provides security insights for findings and various components. And this is kind of important because not only does it give you visibility into your AWS environment, it interacts with your existing technology stacks, or has the ability to integrate there. And it provides you with both, in some cases, bidirectional updates, but it certainly can help you with setting up like your SOC teams and various compliance and security teams to have awareness of what's going on in your environment, but also, set you up for success and proper, I guess what I would call more immediate updates about, indicators of compromise and maybe violations with compliance or encryption that maybe hasn't been enabled or turned off. It gives you really quick updates and lets you take actions much quicker, if not completely automated.
Thanks, Donnie. I appreciate that technical perspective. Austin, for more of an operational perspective, you've been managing IT teams for quite a while now, and your teams are now beginning to use some of these tools and functions within AWS. How do you see these tools helping your team on a day-to-day basis?
Well, so first of all, there is a learning curve, and I think that goes without saying. However, when I look at some of the tools that Donnie mentioned, what I was impressed on is if you do an implementation of any tool, there's a bit of a lag or time frame that occurs before you can see any value coming out of that tool in most cases. Typically it's very difficult to get data out of them and to see what the impact or use case would be. One of the things I've noticed in the tools that are available in AWS and probably cloud in general is the almost immediate gratification of implementing the tools, to being able to see the data and see some of the actions you can take. When you look at our ability to build out systems, the infrastructure as code is something that we've been talking about for probably a really long time, but we now see that as potential and possible. The security tools, I think what I'm most impressed by is that the deployment time is short. There's already, the integration work's already done, and we can see some real data coming out of it almost immediately after implementation. I was pretty impressed with that. So it's easy for any CIO that's currently on this webinar to go with their teams, to go try it out and to get a demo and see some real data. And so, I guess that's the first thing that I took away from it. Now, that's not to say that you're going to just go out to AWS and everything's going to make sense. The first time I went out to AWS, I was kind of taken back by it's literally code, right? Instead of like pretty pictures. But after a little adjustment, it's amazing the array of tools that we have, and the fact that we've gone from a capital purchase model for software to subscription model to being an on-demand model, to being able to try things out. And there's, and I started out by saying one of the challenges we have is rising costs. If we can actually curtail some of that by making sure we're using the right tool for the right job and just those tools, and not having all these overlapping tools are sitting around, that goes a long way too. And I see that as a big potential working with AWS.
Gotcha, thanks. Austin and Donnie, you both mentioned automation being one of those core components within AWS that can provide a lot of value to healthcare organizations. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how healthcare organizations can leverage AWS to automate their infrastructure?
Yeah, that's fine. I'd go first on that one. So yeah, as Austin mentioned, infrastructure as code is a little bit. I don't know if it's a new concept, but for healthcare, like Mike mentioned earlier, sometimes a little bit slower to adopt some new technologies or even approaches. And so infrastructure as code really kind of helps you with, essentially documenting as you create your systems, how those systems should be deployed. And then later on, you have the ability to redeploy those in a similar fashion. So, leveraging, we have something called like Resiliency Hub, for example. You can then comb over that infrastructure as code and look for vulnerabilities. You can look for different, gotchas, security, concerns, things like that. It's like a pure code review almost, but it becomes a little bit easier to read. And then, like I said, your environment's self-documenting. But then you can turn around and put that into some kind of an automated pipeline, and leverage, both dynamic and static code analysis to both improve the quality, but also reduce the risk, and ultimately achieve a pretty high, or at least a higher security posture for the organization. I think the other benefit that sometimes we overlook, we talked about variance in the environment and all the different tools and different approaches. It enables the organization to create a way to standardize and best, both technical deployments, but also embrace best practices. And for that reason, I think that consistency ultimately, leads to a stronger security posture, and it basically is a big driver behind the reason myself and a larger team created something called the Landing Zone Accelerator, which essentially is to help customers stand up their AWS environment using best practices, but it's all through a fully automated through an automated pipeline, basically, that's fairly straightforward to deploy, but ultimately helps you deploy standard controls that healthcare customers would want in place before putting sensitive data into the AWS cloud.
Yeah, no, I think it'd be great to talk a little bit about what one of our customers, one of the health systems, your peers are doing around some of the automation. Austin had mentioned Jeremy Barut. He's the digital modernization officer for Tufts Medicine. And they recently implemented Epic. They were new to Epic. They implemented Epic directly on on AWS. And he says that he's building AI ops infrastructure. And I don't know if you've heard that term before, AI ops. Gartner first used it in 2017. And they define it as the application of machine learning and data science to IT operations. And Jeremy says that he's using this and building his team to operate Epic and their 42 applications that integrate with Epic on AWS. They use things like cloud formation templates to define every little bit of infrastructure as code. That allows them to stand up infrastructure in minutes instead of days. And they use CloudWatch to monitor everything it alerts. And what's really cool, kick off auto remediations for that. And he's calculated that it saves about 20 to 30% in terms of operational costs over doing things on premises. And recall what I mentioned about the Great Resignation and your rock stars. Yeah, he says, you give those folks the training in how to do things, and it opens your eyes to automating a lot of the mundane. It turns into, oh, you want me to do something really cool? Absolutely. So we're seeing folks really stick around because they have that purpose, and this also helps with business resiliency.
Thanks, Mike. So I think we've heard a lot of great theoretical and practical applications of the public cloud and AWS in healthcare. But I think what would really be helpful for our audience is to have an understanding of a good tactical starting point for healthcare organizations within AWS to improve business resiliency. And I know Austin and Mike, you talked a little bit about the project going on at LCMC for an Epic Cloud read-only environment. I believe it's the first of its kind, and Mike, keep me honest here, but I believe it's the first of its kind Epic Cloud read-only in AWS, and also the first of its kind to leverage AWS's healthcare industry landing zone accelerator. So Austin, would you be willing to talk a little bit more about that project, why you undertook it, what it's all about?
As I mentioned before, we are always looking for better and business resiliency strategies that's going to give us more options and flexibility in how we respond to a crisis or any issue. And what we were taken by in this potential solution is our ability to have not only a worst case response, in this case of having to shut down, being attacked by ransomware and having to shut all of our systems down. By the way, as Michael kind of alluded to, our playbook for a ransomware attack is probably not that different from others. Our first course of action is to shut down our backup repositories and all critical systems, which includes Epic. That means we are in a state of down state while we deal with wherever the attack vector may be coming in from. So giving users the ability to at least go to a read-only environment and to continue operation while we deal with that is a huge operational benefit. So that alone made sense. But the other reason for doing that I mentioned is that over time, you want to have a strategy that gives you flexibility and options. So our CIO at LCMC, Tanya Townsend, one of the reasons why I admire her so much is that she doesn't want to be pigeonholed into one option or one strategy only. She wants to have options. She wants to be able to analyze the best course of action for that particular situation and then choose the best option. I think in a Myers-Briggs, she was like dead center in the middle. It was a green personality and kind of being analytical. The problem is that kind of flexibility and agility doesn't just happen. It's something that you've got to plan for. And by having this read-only option available, it essentially gave us all the foundational requirements to have as options to do other things, including being able to leverage the public cloud as a PR environment or possibly leveraging as a full production environment. There's also been discussion about a pilot light approach. Can we go and build it when the need arises? And that may have been something that was impossible to fathom or think about. But if you look at some of the automation examples and some of the infrastructure as a code, we have an engineer on our team that actually I was at a command center for an Epic upgrade go live, and he was playing around with Terraform, and he was doing the infrastructure as a code and kind of building out all the Epic client system servers. And he just said, hey, can I show you something kind of cool? And they said, sure. And he built out the entire Epic client systems environment and had them domain joined and I think we're timing it. It was under 15 minutes, which is kind of amazing to do when you consider that that same exact thing about 5 years ago when we were doing it. By the way, when Kuiper first came out in 2014, we were like, isn't this cool? Now we can do all this automatic deployment of client system servers like in weeks, instead of taking months. And now we're talking about doing it in minutes. So I don't think you can underestimate how powerful this resource is. And we're obviously very excited that we're taking advantage of it in a way that's cost effective and providing immediate value back to the organization.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin. And Mike, from your perspective, what are the best ways healthcare organizations can leverage AWS tactically and immediately to help improve business resiliency?
Yeah, I really love that cloud read-only approach as a starting point to really build confidence in running your EHR on AWS. I love what you said there, Austin, as far as the cost of value piece of it. I think that's the fact that it can provides more immediate value in the form of business resilience at a relatively low cost is one of the 4 reasons that I would suggest starting with that. Secondly, there's minimal change to your current environment, so it's lower risk. Third, you get your system administrators educated and excited on operating this new technology and starting to think about what are some of the things that they can invent and simplify their existing practices. And then fourth, this is something that you can implement quickly. Now I think, Austin, you've been implementing this here now, the landing zone accelerator with cloud read-only as that first initial workload. I mean, your target was 8 weeks to get this done, and very fast, very fast. And so I'm really, first of all, happy that you elected to go with AWS to implement this and to be the first. And I'm really excited to hear about the results.
All right. Thanks, Mike. All right. Well, that is all the questions that I had personally. We've gotten a few direct questions from the audience. Starting off, I think this one is best directed at you, Austin. What sort of training are my end users, clinicians, and business users going to need to undertake for a full production cloud migration?
The training obviously is extensive from a IT perspective. But I want to also emphasize, though, that you do not need to be scared of that. There's a lot of help that's available. So I think these days you can get to value much quicker. In terms of the end users, I'm not really sure if there's a lot of training or change for the end users, because whenever we do anything in healthcare IT, we do think about the impact of the clinicians and the clinician experience. And we want to do things in such a way that it's mostly not something that's visible to them. We want it to be somewhat completely transparent to them. So I think, I don't think end user training will be an issue. Now, from a security perspective, there are some other considerations, but that is probably the same as kind of evolving security considerations, even if they were on-prem.
Gotcha. Thank you. And this one, I think we'll direct this to Mike. So how do I know if my organization is ready to make the migration to the cloud?
I think the beginning of it, actually, before I answer that, can I just add on to what Austin had answered on the first one, an answer to the question that you just shared. From an end user's perspective, I think our goal should be that they have no idea what platform their system is running on, that it is transparent to them. They interact with, if they're running Epic, they interact with Epic. The fact that it's run on a fast and highly available, reliable infrastructure. I mean, that's, if nothing goes, if everything's going smoothly and there aren't any bumps in the road, they have no idea what it's running on. And so there's no real training on that. Now, with respect to the cloud read-only, there might be some training in terms of downtime practices that you go through, so that if you do have to go to the cloud read-only version, how to point your browser to this site so that you understand what those practices are. And those are things that could be also done during some downtime, scheduled downtime practices that the organizations commonly do when they test things like business continuity access web or business continuity access PC. Let's also do some testing with some of that, the cloud read-only piece. But that really doesn't involve a lot of training. That's more from an operational standpoint, making sure that the end users understand what the operating procedures are in those type of situations and how that communication occurs. Less technical, more operational piece. And this is where taking advantage of the healthcare landing zone accelerator is really helpful, because with that comes some basic training on getting your system administrators involved and getting them familiar with how to deploy and operate the EHR on AWS. And you're doing this all in parallel to the system that you're already running, whether it be on VMware, whether it be on IBM. That part's not at risk at all. You're getting your system administrators comfortable with the operational ways of doing it. There's certainly training and certifications that could be run. That's certainly up to the organization whether or not they want to put their system administrators through that training. And it could be that one of the green light, the go forwards, is that the staff has received the certifications on operating AWS. It isn't necessarily required, but that could be a certain path just to make sure that they are ready to go from a personnel perspective. And I don't know, Donnie, if you wanted to add on to anything there, because we happen to be pretty lucky that one of the authors of the healthcare landing zone accelerator is here. And in terms of Donnie, is there anything that you would add to that?
Well, I think, like I said, the idea around consistency and I love the idea, by the way, that you said that the end users shouldn't have any awareness of what's going on. Like I remember that was something that we thought of as we had a doctor that called in a couple of times and said, hey, Citrix this or this technology is that, and then it was actually a topic of discussion around if our providers are becoming aware of the technology, then that's probably a little overreaching, and we need to do a better job of making sure that their experience is focused on providing healthcare, not technology. But as far as the landing zone accelerator goes, like I said, the whole premise behind it is just making sure that customers start off with a positive and consistent, secure experience with the AWS cloud. And obviously, compliance is something that is important to everybody, and should be a focus of any solution that gets deployed. And so the main goal behind this was, how do we just essentially be customer obsessed and work backwards from what those critical needs are, and essentially remove as much of the burden as possible off of the technology providers and certainly the providers of healthcare, and ultimately make sure that you can answer the questions, how secure am I, how many controls do I have in place, and ultimately, am I meeting my regulatory requirements, and which ones are implemented and which ones still need to be taken into consideration. So the whole idea is around really just being customer obsessed and ensuring that healthcare gets delivered in the most efficient and secure way possible.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Donnie. With that, we will go ahead and wrap up the session. First, I'd like to thank everyone who watched this webinar. We hope you gained a lot of insight from this discussion. If you'd like to learn more about Sapphire Health and how they can support you, please scan the QR code to get in contact. I'd also like to thank our panelists today for a great discussion. We know you guys take a lot of time to do these sessions, so it is greatly appreciated. With that, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and thanks for joining.